In the autumn of 1889, Dr. Alistair Crenshaw entered a locked room on a private asylum's third floor. He didn't emerge for 6 hours. When he finally did, his hair had gone white, his hands wouldn't stop shaking, and he refused to speak of what he'd seen. Within a week, he resigned, burning every notebook he owned. Pressed for details, he whispered only this: "Whatever that thing is behind that door, it is not a woman, and it has been alive for far longer than any of us have been told." The patient's name was Amelia Thorne, recorded as 26. But a hidden ledger revealed an admission date of 1831, 58 years before Dr. Crenshaw ever stepped into that room. This is the disturbing story of Amelia Thorne and the secret Victorian England spent nearly a century trying to bury. Before we dive in, press subscribe and let us know where in the world you're watching from. The village of Wenlow sits in a fold of the Berkshire countryside, a place so unremarkable that most maps of the period simply left it off. It had a church, a coaching inn, a blacksmith, and roughly 140 souls who worked the surrounding farms. It also had, on a hill overlooking the eastern approach, a large gray manor house known locally as Thorne End. The Thorne family had owned that land since the reign of Henry VIII. By the early 1800s, the line had thinned to a single branch. Edmund Thorne, his wife Cecilia, and their only child, a daughter born in the spring of 1823. That daughter was Amelia. What we know of her early life comes from 3 sources: the parish baptismal record, a letter written by her governess to her sister in Bath, and the fragmentary diary of a Wenlow curate. All 3 sources agree on the same unsettling detail. Amelia Thorne did not age the way other children aged. The governess, a woman named Harriet Pell, wrote of her charge with a growing unease that reads, "Even now, like the slow tightening of a hand around a throat." Amelia, she noted, was quiet, obedient, and startlingly intelligent. But she was also, in Miss Pell's exact words, still and small in a way that never seems to change. In 1827, at the age of 4, Amelia was described as looking 3. In 1830, at the age of 7, she was described as looking 4. By 1832, when she was 9 years old, the child looked no older than 5, and the governess had begun sleeping with a candle burning through the night. Miss Pell resigned that spring. Her final letter contained only 1 line of explanation. "I cannot remain in a house where a child watches me sleep and does not blink for hours at a time." She was replaced by a series of governesses, none of whom stayed longer than a season. Then, in the summer of 1831, Edmund Thorne shot himself in his study. His wife, Cecilia, was found the following morning walking barefoot in the eastern field, unable to speak, holding a lock of her daughter's hair in a closed fist. She was committed to a private hospital in London and lived for another 40 years, never uttering a coherent sentence again. Amelia, aged 8 but appearing 5, was declared a ward of her uncle, a barrister named Julius Thorne, and within the year she was quietly transferred to the private asylum in Berkshire that would house her for the rest of recorded history. The asylum was called Blackmarsh, It was not a place for the poor or the raving. Blackmarsh was where wealthy families sent the relatives they wished to forget. Its walls were high. Its staff were paid 3 times the going rate, and its records were considered by legal arrangement the private property of the presiding warden. Amelia Thorne was placed in a room on the 3rd floor at the eastern end of the corridor, room 17. Her uncle paid the annual keeping fee, an enormous sum by the standards of the period, and requested only that she never be released, never be photographed. Wrote that room 17 had 2 locks on the outside of the door and 1 on the inside. He was told never to enter alone, never to speak to the occupant, and that the meals delivered through the small hatch at the base of the door came back mostly untouched. No one at Blackmarsh had ever seen the occupant eat. On his 3rd night at the post, Blackwood heard something through the door that he described only as a voice like paper being folded very slowly. It was singing, a lullaby he did not recognize in a language he could not place. When he asked the day warden about it, he was told that the occupant sometimes sang, and that he was not to listen, and that if he could not follow that instruction, he would be dismissed without wages. He learned not to listen, but he wrote that the singing continued on and off for 18 years. Blackwood recorded other things. He wrote that once a year on the same date in September, a physician was brought to the asylum to examine the occupant of room 17. He wrote that the physician was always different and always paid a full year's salary for a single visit and always required to sign a document, swearing never to describe what he had seen. He wrote that, on one occasion, in the autumn of 1867, the visiting physician had staggered out of the room, walked directly to the asylum well, and had to be physically restrained from throwing himself into it. That physician was sedated, transported home in a carriage with the curtains drawn, and never seen at Blackmarsh again. Blackwood wrote that he asked the head warden only once what the occupant of room 17 actually was. The head warden looked at him for a long moment and said, in a voice that Blackwood described as almost pitying, "She is what happens when you love a child so much that you refuse to let her leave." Blackwood did not ask again. The strangest passages describe the interior of room 17. A small bed, though no one had ever seen the occupant lie in it. A washstand, though no one had ever seen the occupant use it. A shelf of books in 3 languages, replaced every 7 years, whether they had been read or not. A single high window, barred and papered over from the outside, and on the wall opposite the door, a full-length mirror covered by a heavy black cloth. Blackwood wrote that in his 18 years at Blackmarsh, he saw the cloth over the mirror slip only once. It was during a summer storm in 1873. A servant had opened the corridor window to let the air through, and a draft had lifted the corner of the cloth for perhaps 5 seconds. Blackwood was passing the door at that moment. He wrote that he saw in the mirrors a small pale figure standing perfectly still in the middle of the room, its back to the door. When the cloth fell back into place, the figure in the mirror had turned its head slowly to look directly at him through the reflection. He did not sleep for 4 nights. He requested a transfer to the ground floor and never worked the 3rd floor corridor again. He wrote 3 weeks later that he had begun to suspect the occupant of room 17 was not aging, because the occupant was not, in any sense he understood the word, alive. By the 1880s, Blackmarsh was struggling, and rumors had begun to spread through the medical community about the room on the 3rd floor that no one was permitted to enter. In the spring of 1889, a new head warden was appointed. His name was Dr. Reginald Holloway, and unlike his predecessors, he did not believe in leaving inherited mysteries undisturbed. Holloway wrote to the Thorne family, requesting permission to have the occupant of room 17 properly examined. The family refused. He wrote again. They refused again. He wrote a 3rd time threatening to petition the courts on grounds of medical negligence. That letter was answered by a solicitor in London who informed Holloway that any attempt to interfere with the standing arrangements would result in the immediate withdrawal of the family's endowment, which represented roughly 1/3 of Blackmarsh's annual income. Holloway backed down publicly. Privately, he arranged for a physician to visit the asylum under a false name. That physician was Dr. Alistair Crenshaw. Crenshaw arrived at Blackmarsh on the 14th of October, 1889. He was 31 years old, newly qualified, and considered one of the most promising physicians of his generation. According to the account he gave a colleague many years later, the rooms smelled of nothing at all. No must, no unwashed body, no lamp oil, no soap, nothing. The air, Crenshaw said, was completely neutral, as though the room itself was somehow outside of the normal processes of the world. The occupant was standing in the far corner facing the wall. She was small. She was wearing a plain gray dress of a style that had gone out of fashion 60 years earlier. Her hair was long and dark and appeared to have been recently brushed, though no brush was visible in the room. When Holloway said her name, she turned around. Crenshaw described her face as that of a child of perhaps 6 years old, with skin so pale it seemed almost translucent, and eyes that were the exact color and shape of a child's eyes, but that held behind them something that was not a child at all. She smiled at him. She said, in perfect English, "Good afternoon, Doctor. My uncle told me you would come." He asked her which uncle. She said, "All of them." Then she asked him if he would like to sit down. There was no chair. Crenshaw remained in the room for 6 hours. He never wrote down what was said, and the only description he ever gave of the conversation was that Amelia Thorne spoke calmly, coherently, and with the vocabulary of an educated adult about events, people, and places that no living person could possibly have known. She described the interior of Thorne End as it had been in 1825. She described the exact weather on the day her father shot himself. She described her mother's face in the moment before Cecilia was found in the eastern field. She described in detail the funeral of Queen Victoria's mother, an event that occurred in 1861 from what appeared to be a first-hand memory, though Amelia had been locked inside room 17 for the previous 30 years. Crenshaw asked her at one point how old she was. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "I stopped counting when it stopped mattering." He asked her what she meant. She said, "I mean that I am the same age I was when they decided I should stay this way." He asked her who they were. She smiled again, and she said only, "The ones who loved me." Crenshaw asked her if she wanted to leave the room. She said, "I have not been inside this room for a very long time, Doctor. I am only ever here when someone opens the door." When he finally left the room at just past 10:00 in the evening, he was no longer the man who had entered it. He would not eat for 2 days. He would not speak of the visit for 18 months. And when he did finally speak of it, he said one thing that has been recorded in the historical account. Whatever agreement was made in that house in Berkshire in the 1820s, whatever bargain her parents entered into to keep that child from dying, it is still holding, and it will keep holding, and no one in this world has the authority to break it. He resigned from medicine within the month. Amelia Thorne remained in room 17. The family's payments resumed. The lock was refastened. The cloth was redraped over the mirror. And for another 11 years, the situation continued as it had continued for the previous 70. But the Thorne family had dwindled to a single surviving heir, a great-great-nephew named Nathaniel Thorne, who was living in London and had shown no interest in the country estate. In the spring of 1900, he was informed by the family solicitor that the annual payment to Blackmarsh was due. He had never met Amelia Thorne. He had assumed, until that spring, that the relative in question was a woman of at least 90, if not deceased. When he wrote to Blackmarsh, requesting confirmation of the patient's age and condition, he received a reply that consisted of one sentence. "Miss Thorne is in the same condition she has been in for the entirety of her residence at this institution." Nathaniel Thorne did not send the payment. He instructed the solicitor to inform Blackmarsh that the family's endowment would cease at the end of the calendar year. The response from Blackmarsh was not from the head warden. It was from the entire senior staff, jointly, hand-delivered to Nathaniel Thorne's London address by a junior physician who had ridden through the night to bring it. The letter ran to 6 pages. It described what the senior staff of Blackmarsh believed the occupant of room 17 to be, and it ended with a plea. "Sir," the letter concluded, "we do not know what will happen if the door is opened by strangers. We do not know what will happen if she is moved. We do not know what will happen if the mirror is uncovered by hands unfamiliar to this house. We know only that for 70 years the arrangement has held, and that in the moments when it has been disturbed, men have been unmade. We beg you, for the sake of your family name, and for the sake of whatever it is your ancestors bargained away, do not stop the payments." Nathaniel Thorne read the letter twice. He did not believe a word of it. He would travel to Berkshire himself, view the patient, and put an end to what he considered a superstitious fraud. He arrived at Blackmarsh on the 11th of December, 1900. He was met at the gate by the head warden, who begged him not to enter room 17. He was met in the corridor by 2 senior physicians who begged him not to enter. He was met at the door of the room itself by the elderly Dr. Holloway, retired, but summoned back for the occasion, who went down on his knees in the corridor and begged him not to go inside. Nathaniel Thorne stepped over the old man and went in. What happened in the 12 minutes he spent in that room is not recorded. No one else was permitted to enter with him. When he came out, he was entirely calm. He walked past Holloway without a word, down the stairs, out of the asylum, and to his waiting carriage. He rode back to London that same night. In the morning, he wrote a single letter to Blackmarsh, authorizing the resumption of all payments indefinitely and increasing the sum by 50%. He never spoke of Amelia Thorne to any living person for the rest of his life. He never married, he never had children. On the 10th anniversary of his visit to room 17, in December of 1910, he was found in his London study, seated in a chair facing a mirror that had been carefully uncovered, with an expression on his face that the coroner recorded only as one of complete and lucid understanding. He had died, so far as anyone could determine, of nothing at all. He was 42 years old. The payments to Blackmarsh continued. A trust had been established, on Nathaniel's instructions, to ensure that they would continue in perpetuity. The trust still exists. It is registered in London, under a name that does not include the word Thorne. Its records are sealed. Blackmarsh itself closed in 1952. Its buildings were sold, demolished, and the land was cleared. But the eastern wing of the 3rd floor, which contained the corridor that led to room 17, was not demolished with the rest. The buyer of the property, a private individual whose name has never been made public, purchased the site on the sole condition that the eastern wing be preserved intact, that the room at the end of the corridor never be opened, and that the trust continue to pay for its maintenance and its guarding. Aerial photographs taken in the 1970s show a small, preserved wing standing in the middle of an otherwise empty field. Local residents refer to it as the Thorne Room. It is not marked on any Ordnance Survey map. It is surrounded by a high wall. It is patrolled by a single caretaker, who is replaced every 7 years, and who is required as a condition of employment to never enter the wing itself. We do not know what is inside the room now. We do not know whether Amelia Thorne is still there, if she was ever there in the way we understand the word, or if the entire arrangement is, and always was, a piece of institutional theater kept alive by fear and inherited guilt. But we know that in 1968, a journalist named Harold Wren attempted to write an investigative piece about the Thorne Room for a London magazine. He interviewed former Blackmarsh staff, tracked down descendants of Dr. Crenshaw, and photographed the exterior of the preserved wing. His article was scheduled to run in the November issue. It did not run. Wren withdrew it 3 weeks before publication and asked that his research materials be destroyed. When his editor pressed him for a reason, Wren said only that he had received a letter, and that whoever had written it knew things about him that no one on this earth should have been able to know. He would only say that the signature had been in the hand of a child, and that the ink, when he first opened the envelope, had still been wet. Over a century, a small, pale figure in a gray dress may or may not be waiting patiently, as she has waited for 200 years, for someone to lift the cloth from the mirror and finally see her clearly. Whether she is a woman, a memory, or something that once wore the shape of a child and never quite gave it back, we do not know. What we know is what the head warden of Blackmarsh told Thomas Blackwood in 1863 in a voice that Blackwood described as almost pitying. She is what happens when you love a child so much that you refuse to let her leave. Sleep well tonight, wherever in the world you are. And if you have a mirror in your bedroom, do the room a small kindness and cover it before you turn out the light.